still. The clink of my fork against the oak table froze when my son said, "Dad, you eat but you don't help," and the overhead light felt suddenly too bright. As I set the fork down carefully instead of reacting, my fingers resting on the smooth wood I'd paid for decades ago, while the light hummed above us. It illuminated every plate, every face, and the silence no one rushed to break. The same steady glow followed my thoughts as I counted repairs, payments, and years quietly rewritten as nothing. As I realized this wasn't about bills, but about shrinking me in my own home, something settled cold and clear. That's when, under that unchanging light, I decided I wouldn't argue. I'd let ownership speak for me. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The dining room still smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, the kind Frank used every Sunday out of habit, even after Linda passed. The table was the same oak one he'd hauled into the house 23 years ago, its surface worn smooth where elbows had rested through homework, holidays, and quiet breakfasts before work. Tonight, 4 plates sat evenly spaced beneath the overhead light. Frank took his seat slowly, easing himself down, feeling the familiar creak of the chair he'd fixed twice already. This was his house. Every nail, every repair, every payment, his hands were in all of it. Marcus dropped into his chair harder, phone face down beside his plate like it was still buzzing with demands. He exhaled loudly, rubbing his temples before the food was even touched. Jenna sat beside him, posture straight, napkin folded carefully on her lap. Sophie slid into her seat last, earbuds dangling around her neck, eyes already reading the room the way she'd learned to. Marcus started before the first bite. "Electric bill jumped again," he said, shaking his head. "Insurance went up too, and groceries don't even get me started." He speared a piece of chicken with more force than necessary. "Feels like everything's on my shoulders lately." Frank nodded once, reaching for his water. He'd heard this tone before. Pressure dressed up as righteousness. Marcus kept going. "I'm working overtime, Jens, stretching every dollar and still—" He gestured vaguely around the room. "Everyone's got to pull their weight. That's just how life works." Jenna murmured something non-committal, already standing to grab the salt even though it was within reach. Sophie watched her father carefully, then glanced at Frank, as if checking whether he was hearing the same thing she was. Marcus finally looked straight at him. "I mean, come on, Dad, you're home all day. No mortgage, no commute. But the bills don't stop just because you're retired." Frank chewed slowly, tasting garlic and something metallic underneath it. He swallowed. "I pay my share," he said evenly. Marcus scoffed. "Your share?" He laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You eat. You use the lights, the AC, the water. But you don't really help." The words hung there heavy and careless. Then Marcus said it. Clear, loud, in front of everyone. "Dad, you eat but you don't help." Frank felt it land not like a punch, but like something colder. A clean slice. He kept his face still, eyes on his plate, breathing measured. Inside, a slow heat spread through his chest. Not rage, not yet humiliation. The kind that seeps in quietly when someone rewrites your worth out loud. Jenna didn't say a word. She stood, gathered empty plates, and moved to the sink, the clink of porcelain sounding too loud in the silence. No correction, no protest, just motion. As if this were a normal conversation. As if the insult had been a minor spill to clean up. Sophie's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Her eyes flicked from her father to her grandfather, wide and searching. She looked like she wanted to say something, anything, but didn't know where it was safe to land. Frank lifted his glass and took a slow sip of water. He felt the coolness steady him. He thought of the summer he'd replaced the roof himself to save money. Of the night shifts he'd taken when Marcus was little so there'd be food on this very table. Of the mortgage statement stamped paid in full, folded carefully in a drawer. He smiled. It surprised even him how natural it looked. Polite, almost gentle. "Excuse me," he said, pushing his chair back. "I forgot something." Marcus shrugged, already back to his phone. Jenna rinsed plates. Sophie watched Frank stand, her confusion deepening into something like fear. Frank walked down the hallway at an unhurried pace. Each step felt deliberate, like he was placing his feet on a path he'd only just noticed. He closed the bedroom door softly behind him and crossed to the filing cabinet in the corner, the one Marcus never touched. He knelt, slid open the bottom drawer, and pulled out a thick folder. Across the front, in his own handwriting, were the words, "Deed plus taxes." Frank opened it and began to read, the smile still faintly on his face, as something quiet and irreversible started to take shape. Frank woke before the sun, the house still wrapped in that thin, uneasy quiet that comes after something breaks but hasn't fallen yet. The digital clock read 5:12 a.m. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly, each rotation bringing the same sentence back with it. "You eat, but you don't help." The words felt like a bruise you keep pressing just to check if it still hurts. Frank swung his legs over the bed and stood, joints stiff, pride heavier than his bones. In the kitchen, he moved by muscle, memory filter, grounds, water, listening to the coffee maker gurgle to life. Linda used to say mornings told you the truth about a house, whether it welcomed you or warned you. He took his mug to the table and sat alone, watching the light creep in through the blinds. He thought about everything he'd fixed in this place, everything he'd paid for, everything that had quietly become invisible once his hands stopped earning a paycheck. By the time Marcus came out, dressed for work and already irritated, Frank had finished his coffee. "We need to talk about how things work around here," Marcus said, not sitting, just leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. Going forward, Frank looked up calmly. "About what?" "About fairness," Marcus replied. "I'm not trying to be disrespectful, Dad, but everyone has to contribute. Rent, chores, something. You can't just exist here." The word lingered. Exist. Frank nodded once, absorbing it. "So what are you suggesting?" Marcus exhaled like he was tired of being reasonable. "You pay a set amount every month, or you take on responsibilities, yard, repairs, whatever. You earn your keep." Frank studied his son's face. There was no anger there, not really, just certainty. The kind that comes when someone believes the ground belongs to them. "Whose house is this?" Frank asked quietly. Marcus didn't hesitate. "It's our home now." The answer landed heavier than the insult the night before. Frank felt something settle in his chest, solid and cold. He stood and rinsed his mug slowly, buying time. That's when Jenna appeared in the doorway, already dressed, phone in hand. "I think this could actually be good for you," she said, tone light, helpful. "Downsizing, I mean. Less space, less stress. People our age do it all the time." "Our age." Frank almost smiled. "You wouldn't have to worry about maintenance," Jenna continued. "Or bills. It's not about pushing you out. It's about what's smart." Frank turned to face them both. In that moment, it became clear. They weren't negotiating. They were reshaping the story one small rule at a time until his authority faded into memory. Until he was a dependent in a house with his name still on the walls, but not on the power. "I'll think about it," Frank said evenly. Marcus relaxed, already satisfied. Jenna nodded, like progress had been made. After they left, the house felt different, smaller. Frank sat back down at the table and stared at the wood grain, tracing a groove with his finger. This wasn't about money. It wasn't even about chores. It was about control and about who got to decide when someone stopped being useful. He reached for his phone and stepped outside onto the back porch. The air was cool, damp with early summer humidity. He dialed a number he hadn't called in a while. "Rosa," he said when his sister answered. "I need to see you quietly." She didn't ask why. "When?" "Soon," Frank replied. "Today, if you can." After the call, he stood there listening to the neighborhood wake-up sprinklers clicking on, a car door slamming somewhere down the street. He felt the urge to go back inside and shout, to demand respect, to remind them of everything he'd done. But shouting wouldn't fix this. Words hadn't built this house. Paper had. Frank went back inside, opened the filing cabinet, and slid the Deed plus Taxes folder out again. He sat at the table, flipping through pages with steady hands, his jaw set not with anger but with resolve. If they wanted to measure help, he would show them exactly how much power still lived in ink and signatures. The Marina Cafe sat just far enough from the neighborhood that no one dropped in by accident. It smelled like salt, burnt coffee, and sunscreen. The windows open to let the breeze cut the floor to heat. Frank chose a table near the rail, where the water lapped softly against the docks. Rosa arrived 5 minutes later, sunglasses pushed up into her hair, eyes sharp the second she saw his face. She didn't rush him. Rosa never did. They ordered coffee. When it came, Frank wrapped both hands around the mug, feeling the warmth steady him. Then he told her everything dinner, the words Marcus had thrown like a verdict, the rules, the rent, the way Jenna talked about downsizing as if it were a favor. He spoke evenly, but his voice tightened in places he didn't bother to smooth over. Rosa listened without interrupting. No gasps, no advice, just stillness and attention, like she was cataloging every detail for later. When he finished, she leaned back and said, "You paid that house off yourself." Frank nodded. "Years ago, and you never signed it over," she said. "Not a question, no." Rosa took off her sunglasses and set them on the table. "Then they're not pushing you out. They're bluffing and hoping you fold." Frank stared past her, out at the boats, rocking gently in their slips. "They don't think it's a bluff." "They don't have to," Rosa replied. "The law does." That afternoon, Frank drove across town to a low-rise office building with tinted windows and a brass plaque that read Miles Kendrick, Attorney at Law. He carried a battered accordion folder under his arm, thick with tax receipts, insurance, statements, and documents he'd never imagined needing to defend himself with. Miles Kendrick was a solid man with careful eyes and a voice that never rushed. He spread the papers across his desk, scanning dates, signatures, parcel numbers. Frank watched him work, hands folded, heart steady but alert. After a long moment, Miles looked up. "The deed is solely in your name, always has been. You're current on taxes. There's no lien, no transfer, no shared ownership." Frank let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "So it's still my house," he said. "Legally," Miles replied. "It has always been your house." Frank nodded once. Then he asked the question that had been forming since the night before, the one that tasted like both relief and betrayal. "Can I sell it without telling them?" Miles didn't flinch. "Yes, as long as required notices are handled correctly. Occupants have rights to notice, not veto power. Ownership decides the sale." The words settled slowly. Frank felt something shift, not triumph, not joy, but clarity. The kind that comes when the ground stops moving under your feet. "What about my granddaughter?" Frank asked. "Sophie?" Rosa leaned forward. "She's the only one thinking straight in that house." Miles nodded. "Any plan you make can include protections, trusts, accounts, boundaries." Frank imagined Sophie's face at the table, the way her eyes had searched his when Marcus spoke. He nodded again. "I don't want her punished for her parents' mistakes." "Then she won't be," Rosa said firmly. By the time Frank left the office, the sun was sinking low, turning the parking lot gold. He sat in his truck for a moment, hands on the wheel, letting the truth settle in. He wasn't trapped. He hadn't lost anything yet. The house hadn't changed, only the way others spoke inside it. That night, he returned home the same way he always did. He asked how work went. He washed his plate. He listened more than he spoke. His face stayed calm, almost neutral. As Marcus talked about expenses and Jenna scrolled through listings, just to look, no one noticed the difference. No one saw the decision already made. Frank lay in bed later, staring at the ceiling fan again. But this time, the words didn't bruise. They hardened into something useful. Tomorrow, he would begin quietly. No shouting, no warnings, just steps taken in order, while everyone else assumed the house was already theirs. Dana Whitaker arrived just after 10, her sedan pulling into the driveway with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to announce herself. Frank watched from the front window as she stepped out, clipboard tucked under one arm, scanning the house with a practiced eye. He opened the door before she knocked. "Morning," he said. Easy, like she was there to check the AC. Dana smiled. "Frank? I'm Dana." Inside, she moved room to room, while Frank followed a step behind, hands in his pockets. The house felt different with a stranger in it, lighter somehow, like it had already begun loosening its grip. Dana paused in the living room, taking in the natural light, the clean lines Frank had maintained out of habit more than hope. "This will sell," she said simply. "Fast." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Even as is?" She nodded. "But staged properly? Priced right? You'll have leverage." She glanced at him. "You don't strike me as someone who needs a bidding war." "I don't," Frank replied. Dana pointed out small fixes, fresh mulch, neutral linens, a deeper clean in the kitchen corners. Frank listened, nodding, already cataloging what he could handle himself. He felt calm, focused, like a man doing a job he understood. They wrapped up before noon. Dana left through the side door, discreet, and Frank locked it behind her. The house settled back into silence. That afternoon, Frank drove to Miles Kendrick's office. The paperwork was already laid out, neat and precise. Miles walked him through each page, explaining terms Frank already understood but appreciated hearing out loud. When it came time to sign, Frank didn't hesitate. His hand was steady. His name, once written, felt heavier than it ever had before. "This stays confidential," Miles said. "Until it can't," Frank nodded. "That's all I need." When he got home, Marcus was already there, pacing the kitchen, tie loosened, irritation spilling out of him like heat. "You know the water bill's insane, right?" Marcus said. "And the AC's been running nonstop. We've got to start being smarter." Frank set his keys down. "Probably," he said. Marcus stopped, thrown off by the lack of resistance. "I'm serious, Dad." "I know," Frank replied, and reached for a glass. Jenna stood by the counter, sorting mail. As she tossed envelopes, something fluttered out of the trash can near her foot. A white rectangle. She bent, picked it up, and froze. Dana Whitaker, Realtor. The room shifted. Jenna didn't say anything at first. She just looked at the card, then at Frank. Her face went still in a way that made Marcus uneasy. "What's that?" Marcus asked. "Nothing," Frank said mildly. Jenna waited. When nothing else came, her grip tightened on the card. "You didn't mention having company today." Frank met her eyes. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain it. He just held the look a beat longer than necessary, then turned away. Dinner passed in clipped conversation. Marcus complained. Jenna watched. Sophie stayed quiet, eyes flicking between adults like she was tracking weather. That night, long after the lights went out, Frank lay awake. The house breathed around him old pipes, settling wood. From down the hall, through the thin walls, he heard Marcus's voice, low and urgent. "We need to lock him down." Frank stared into the dark, pulse steady. They were finally afraid, and he was already ahead. They waited until morning, like that made it respectable. Frank was already at the table when Marcus and Jenna came in, a stack of papers tucked neatly under Marcus's arm. The smell of toast hung in the kitchen, warm and ordinary. The kind of morning that pretended nothing was wrong. Sophie hovered near the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder, eyes already uneasy. Marcus cleared his throat and laid the papers out between them, squaring the edges like he was presenting something official. "We put something together," he said, "just to make things clear. For everyone." Frank glanced down but didn't touch it yet. "Clear about what?" "About the future," Jenna said quickly, sliding into the chair beside Marcus. Her voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "Security, fairness." Marcus nodded. "I cover most of the expenses now. Utilities, groceries, repairs. This just reflects reality." He tapped the top page. "It's a family agreement." Frank finally picked it up. The language was clean, professional, stripped of warmth, transfer of interest, shared ownership, permanent residence rights for Marcus. His eyes moved slowly, deliberately, taking in each line. Then he noticed the bottom. The notary section was already filled out. Tomorrow's date. Frank's jaw tightened for half a second before he smoothed it away. He looked up, expression mild. "You've been busy." Marcus leaned back, arms crossed. "We're just trying to protect everyone. If something happens to you, then the house stays in the family." Jenna finished. No confusion, no stress. Frank nodded, as if considering the idea for the first time. Inside, something cold and precise locked into place. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a trap, dressed up as concern. Sophie stepped forward, voice small but steady. "Why would Grandpa sign something he doesn't understand?" The room went quiet. Marcus turned on her fast. "This is adult business, Sophie." "But—" She tried again. "I said enough." His voice was sharp now, impatient. "You don't get a vote here." Frank felt the air change. He looked at his granddaughter, saw the way her shoulders drew in, the way she'd learned to retreat when voices rose. He set the papers down gently. "I'll review it," Frank said, smiling faintly. "After breakfast." Marcus hesitated, clearly wanting more. A signature, a commitment. But Jenna touched his arm, subtle, calming. "That's fine," she said. "No rush." Frank folded the agreement and placed it beside his plate. "I appreciate you thinking ahead." Marcus relaxed, satisfaction flickering across his face. "Good. I just want us all on the same page." They left the room together, voices low, already discussing logistics. Sophie lingered, glancing at Frank with worry etched into her face. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. Frank smiled at her, softer this time. "Go to school," he said. "I'll be right here." When the door closed behind her, the house went still. Frank sat alone, staring at the folded document like it might move on its own. He took out his phone, fingers steady despite the heat in his chest, and typed a single message. "They're attempting a deed trap." He hit send, then carefully slid the agreement back into its folder. The game was no longer quiet. Miles Kendrick moved fast once Frank forwarded the message. By noon, a formal refusal letter was drafted, polite, firm, airtight. It stated that Frank declined any transfer of ownership, acknowledged no shared interest, and rejected the so-called family agreement in full. Miles sent it certified, electronic, and logged. Then he made the second move, quieter but sharper. A fraud alert filed with the county recorder, flagging the property against unauthorized filings. "If they try anything," Miles said over the phone, "it slows them down, and it leaves a trail." "That's all I need," Frank replied. Next came the personal locks. Frank sat at the dining table with his laptop, sunlight spilling across the same wood where Marcus had told him he didn't help. He froze his credit with all 3 bureaus, changed passwords he hadn't touched in years, and set 2-factor authentication on utilities, insurance, and banking. Each click felt like reclaiming a boundary he didn't realize had been crossed. No shouting, no confrontation, just doors closing quietly. Dana called that afternoon. "I've got a photographer available this week," she said. "But we should tighten things up first. Little repairs, they add up." Frank smiled to himself. "I'll handle it." He did. Over the next few days, he moved through the house with tools in hand, fixing what had been ignored because Marcus called it not urgent. He tightened loose hinges, patched drywall, resealed the guest bathroom sink. He pressure washed the patio himself, sweat darkening his shirt, muscles remembering work they hadn't forgotten. Each repair felt like a quiet rebuttal. At night, when the house settled, Sophie would slip into his room. They packed slowly old photos, Linda's jewelry, handwritten recipes tucked into a small tin. Sophie didn't ask questions. She just handed things to him carefully, like she understood these weren't objects. They were proof. "You're not useless," she whispered once, anger trembling beneath her voice. Frank squeezed her hand. "I know." Rosa stopped by midweek, eyes scanning the house like she could already feel the tension in the walls. "You can stay with me," she said gently, "as long as you need." Frank shook his head. "I'm planning bigger." Rosa studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, just don't do it alone." "I'm not," Frank said, thinking of folders, signatures, and timelines already moving without noise. Meanwhile, Marcus grew lighter, almost cheerful. He talked about future renovations, about when things are settled. He assumed the agreement was working its magic simply because Frank hadn't exploded. Jenna watched Frank closely, but every day that passed without resistance relaxed her shoulders a little more. They thought silence meant surrender. Frank let them think it. He fixed one last loose board on the back steps as the sun went down, wiping his hands on a rag. Inside, Marcus laughed at something on his phone, the sound careless, confident. Frank stood there a moment longer, looking at the house, not with attachment, but with clarity. Let them believe they were winning. The paperwork was already doing the talking. Saturday arrived bright and humid, the kind of Florida morning that made everything feel exposed. Frank woke early anyway. Already dressed, already steady. Dana had been clear. Discreet, targeted, no signage. Serious buyers only, people who didn't wander in by accident. By 10, the house no longer belonged to silence. Voices moved softly through the rooms, measured, curious, respectful. Dana guided couples through the living room, pointing out the light, the layout, the care, and the upkeep. Frank stayed near the kitchen, answering questions when asked, offering facts without stories. He didn't hover. He didn't sell. He simply existed as the owner. That alone felt like power. Every creak of the floorboard sounded different with strangers on them. Frank noticed it all, but nothing rattled him. Marcus was at work. Jenna was supposed to be running errands. The timing was tight, intentional. Then the front door opened again. Jenna stepped inside, keys still in her hand, smile ready, until she saw unfamiliar shoes lined neatly by the wall. A couple stood near the hallway, murmuring about square footage. Another man peered out the backslider toward the patio. Jenna's smile froze. She looked at Frank, eyes sharp with confusion that tipped quickly into alarm. "What's going on?" Frank turned calmly. "Open house." Her laugh came out thin. "Open house for what?" Dana stepped in smoothly, extending a hand. "Hi, I'm Dana, the listing agent." Jenna's gaze snapped back to Frank. "Listing agent? These are guests," Frank said evenly, gesturing around the room. "Like you." The word hit her. Guests. Jenna's smile wobbled. Just enough for Frank to see the effort it took to hold it together. She pulled her phone out and turned away, fingers moving fast. Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, fury leading him through the door. "What the hell is this?" he shouted, ignoring Dana, ignoring the buyers still present. Dana stepped between him and the living room. "Sir, you need to lower your voice. This is my house," Marcus snapped. Dana didn't blink. "No, it isn't. Frank Delian is the sole owner and seller of this property." Marcus turned to Frank, face flushed. "You can't do this." Frank met his eyes. "I already am." "Shut it down," Marcus barked. "Now." Dana held firm. "Legally, there's nothing you can do." The buyers watched in silence, discomfort thick but curiosity sharper. Frank felt the tension but didn't rush to end it. This moment mattered. Marcus stepped closer to Frank, lowering his voice. "You can't do this to your family." Frank didn't raise his voice. He didn't harden it either. "You told me I don't help," he said. "So I'm helping myself." Something cracked, then not loudly, but visibly. Marcus looked around the room, at the strangers imagining their lives, inside these walls, at Dana's clipboard, at Jenna's pale face. "This isn't over," Marcus said. Frank nodded once. "No, it's just started." Dana resumed the tour, professionalism intact, control restored. One by one, buyers drifted out, expressions thoughtful, interest unmistakable. By late afternoon, the house emptied again, returning to its bones. Marcus stood in the living room, fists clenched, breathing hard. Jenna stared at the floor. Frank walked past them both, unhurried, already thinking ahead. The door closed behind him with a soft, final sound that promised nothing would ever be the same again. The offers came in faster than Frank expected. Dana called the next morning, her voice crisp but contained. "We've got 3 already," she said. 2 conventional, 1 cash, all serious. Frank sat at the kitchen table, sunlight catching the grain of the wood. "Which one would you take?" There was a pause on the line. "If you want top dollar, we can push. If you want certainty control, I'd take the cash offer. Clean, quick, close. No inspections dragging things out." Frank pictured Marcus's face at the open house. The panic behind the anger. The belief that time was still on his side. "I don't need applause," Frank said. "I need it done." Dana exhaled softly, approving. "I'll send it to Miles." By noon, Frank was back in Miles Kendrick's office. The contract lay open between them, clean and precise, the kind of document that didn't care about family dynamics or raised voices. Miles walked him through each clause, each date, each obligation. "Closing in 10 days, Miles said. "Buyer's flexible. We'll schedule it when you want." Frank didn't hesitate. "During the week, midday." Miles smiled faintly. He knew what that meant. "I'll handle it." When Frank got home that evening, Marcus was already there. But something was different. The edge was gone. In its place was something smoother, almost friendly. Marcus opened the fridge and pulled out a beer. "You want one, Dad?" Frank looked up from his chair. "I'm good." Marcus shrugged and handed him the bottle anyway, setting it down within reach. He leaned against the counter, casual. "You know, I've been thinking. Things got tense. That's on me." Frank studied him quietly. The posture, the softened voice. He'd seen it before when Marcus wanted something. "We're family," Marcus continued. "We don't need lawyers and strangers involved. We can figure this out together." Frank nodded once. "Can we?" Marcus smiled. "Of course. You don't have to rush anything." There it was. Frank felt no anger now. just clarity. This wasn't love. It was damage control. Later that night, Sophie knocked on his door. She didn't come all the way in, just stood there, twisting her fingers together. "Are you really leaving?" she asked. Frank set his papers aside. "Yes." Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. "Can I come with you?" The question hit him harder than any insult Marcus had thrown. Frank stood and knelt in front of her, meeting her eye level. "You always have a place with me," he said gently. "Always, no matter where I am." She nodded, biting her lip, holding herself together the way she'd learned to. The next morning, Frank returned to Miles's office alone. The acceptance waited on the desk, clipped and ready. He read it once more, not because he doubted it, but because he wanted to feel the weight of the decision. When he signed, his hand didn't shake. Outside, the day moved on like nothing had changed. Cars passed. People went to work. Somewhere across town, Marcus was on shift, believing there was still time to maneuver, to soften, to regain control. Frank folded the copy of the contract and placed it carefully in his folder. The house wasn't sold yet, but it was already gone. The rumors started quietly, the way all damage does when it's meant to look like concern. Frank heard about them secondhand. A cousin stopped calling. An aunt left a voicemail that sounded careful, overly gentle. When Rosa finally told him what Jenna was saying, Frank wasn't surprised. "She's telling people you're confused," Rosa said over the phone, "that you're making rash decisions, that you don't really understand what you're doing." Frank sat at the table, phone to his ear, staring at the same spot in the wood where Marcus's knuckles had pressed days earlier. "Of course she is. She's framing it like worry," Rosa continued. "Like she's protecting you." Frank exhaled slowly. "Protection doesn't start with lies." Marcus went louder. He called Rosa directly, voice tight with accusation. "What did you say to him?" he demanded. "You've been in his head. This wasn't his idea." Rosa didn't raise her voice. "He's not a child, Marcus." "He's not thinking straight," Marcus snapped. "And you know it." Rosa paused just long enough to make it hurt. "The only thing poisoning your father," she said, "is the way you talk to him." Frank didn't correct anyone. He didn't return calls. He didn't defend himself to relatives who hadn't bothered to ask him directly. He understood something now that he hadn't before. Arguments were for people without leverage. He had paperwork. Miles Kendrick called him in the afternoon. "They may try something formal," he warned. "An injunction, a claim of elder exploitation. It's a common tactic when control slips." Frank felt a flicker of anger then, sharp but brief. And it won't stick if we're prepared," Miles said. "Which we are, but you need to document everything. Every message, every threat, especially that agreement they tried to push." Frank already had a folder started, screenshots printed, dates logged, the so-called family agreement sealed in plastic like evidence. He added Marcus's recent texts, friendly on the surface, frantic underneath. He didn't editorialize. He just preserved. That night, Dana called. "I heard something," she said carefully. "One of the neighbors mentioned Marcus asking around about whether a sale can be stopped, who to call, what options he has." Frank closed his eyes for a moment, not from fear, but from recognition. "Thank you for telling me." "He's rattled," Dana added. "That's usually when people make mistakes." After the call, Frank walked through the house slowly. He touched nothing. He just listened. The air felt charged now, like the pause before a storm breaks. From the living room, he heard Marcus pacing. From the bedroom, Jenna's voice, low and urgent, rehearsing another version of the truth. Frank returned to his room and sat on the edge of the bed. He pulled out his phone and backed everything up again to the cloud, to a drive Rosa held onto, to Miles's office. Redundancy wasn't paranoia. It was survival. They wanted him loud, emotional, defensive. He stayed quiet. The more they talked, the worse they sounded. The more he said nothing, the stronger his position became. He could feel the balance shifting, inch by inch, as desperation crept into their voices and certainty settled into his hands. Someone knocked on his door. Jenna's voice followed, careful. "Frank, we should talk. Tomorrow," he said. She hesitated, then walked away. Frank lay back and stared at the ceiling, the fan spinning steady above him. He knew what was coming next. Interference. A last-minute play. Something reckless enough to feel powerful. He didn't flinch. Whatever they tried, it would only leave more proof behind. Frank woke before his alarm. Already dressed, the folder tucked under his arm like it belonged there. Closing morning felt strangely quiet, as if the house itself were holding its breath. He poured a final cup of coffee, took one measured sip, and reached for his keys. His phone rang. Marcus's name flashed on the screen, then disappeared as the call cut off. A second later, an unfamiliar number replaced it. "Mr. DeLeon?" a woman asked. "This is Officer Ramirez with Tampa Police. Are you safe?" Frank paused, keys still in his hand. "I'm standing in my kitchen. There's been a report that you're missing, sir." Your son expressed concern. Frank closed his eyes for half a second. Not from shock he'd felt this coming, but from the audacity of it. "I'm not missing," he said calmly. "I'm on my way to an appointment." "Please remain where you are," the officer replied. "We're nearby." A knock came less than 5 minutes later, firm but controlled. 2 officers stood on the porch, professional, cautious. Frank opened the door fully. "I'm Frank DeLeon," he said. "I assume this is about my son." Inside, he handed over his ID, answered questions evenly, never raising his voice. He explained the sale, the tension, the threats. He asked politely if the officers would note the report as harassment tied to a property dispute. The older officer nodded, already understanding. "This isn't the first time we've seen this tactic." Frank thanked them. When they left, he checked the time. He was still on schedule. At the title company, Miles Kendrick was already waiting, jacket off, expression tight but controlled. "They tried something," he said the moment Frank sat down. "Of course they did." Miles slid a document across the table. "Someone filed a last-minute claim against the property this morning. Attempted cloud on title." Frank read it once, then again. He saw it immediately, the wrong parcel number, a signature that didn't match anything on file. "They rushed it," Frank said. "They panicked," Miles corrected. The title officer entered, brows drawn together. She reviewed Miles's documentation, compared records, then looked up. "This filing won't hold," she said. "It's defective. Obvious fraud." She stamped the clearance with finality that felt almost ceremonial. Frank signed the closing papers slowly, deliberately. Each page marked the end of something Marcus believed he still controlled. Miles leaned in. "Your son is still at work." Frank nodded. "Let him stay there." Outside, the sun climbed higher. Traffic thickened. Life continued uninterrupted. Somewhere across town, Marcus was checking his phone between tasks, convinced he'd bought himself time, convinced the emergency had worked. Frank walked to his car with the final documents in hand, feeling neither triumph nor regret, only release. The house was sold. And Marcus didn't know yet. Dana placed the sign herself. Frank watched from his car across the street, engine off, window cracked just enough to let the humid air in. The metal post slid into the grass with a dull thud, practiced and final. Sold caught the sunlight, clean and unmistakable. Dana stepped back, checked it from the curb, then glanced toward Frank's car. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. Frank sat there a moment longer, hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling something settle inside his chest. Not joy, not victory, just a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes when a long argument ends without another word being spoken. By noon, the money had moved. Miles had structured it carefully. Layers of protection Frank barely noticed, except for the calm it brought. Accounts insulated, access limited, paper trails clean. Frank watched the confirmation numbers populate on the screen, then closed the laptop. Whatever happened next, the leverage was gone. When Marcus got home, the street told the story before the house did. A moving truck sat half-blocking the driveway. The lockbox hung from the front door handle like a warning bell. Marcus slowed, confusion tightening into alarm as he parked. "What is this?" he shouted the moment he stepped inside. Frank stood in the living room, a single folder in his hand. Jenna followed Marcus in, her face draining as she took in the scene, the labeled boxes stacked neatly, the movers waiting by the truck, the absence of permission she'd assumed she had. Marcus turned on Frank. "You did this on purpose," he yelled. "You waited." Frank didn't deny it. "You're selfish," Marcus continued, voice cracking with fury. "Cruel. You don't care who you hurt." Frank opened the folder and removed a single sheet of paper. He held it out. "This is your move-out notice," he said evenly. "You have the timeline required by law." Marcus stared at it like it might bite him. "You think paper makes this okay?" Jenna's breath came faster now. "Frank, wait, this is moving too fast. We didn't know you knew, Frank said calmly. You just thought I wouldn't act. That's when Sophie stepped forward. She moved to Frank's side without looking at her parents, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for his sleeve. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Marcus saw her then. Really saw her. His voice dropped. Sophie, come here. She didn't move. Jenna covered her mouth, realization dawning too late. Control wasn't slipping, it was gone. The house, the money, the narrative. All of it had been built on the assumption that Frank would stay quiet forever. Frank felt the weight of every repair he'd made, every night he'd stayed silent, every insult he'd swallowed. He looked at Marcus not with anger, but with distance. I didn't take anything from you, Frank said. I took myself out of the equation. Marcus laughed bitterly. So that's it? You walk away? Frank nodded once. Yes. The movers waited, uncomfortable but ready. Dana's instructions had been clear. Everything documented, everything clean. Frank turned slightly toward Sophie. You ready? She nodded, swallowing hard, pride flickering through fear. Behind them, Marcus stood frozen, the notice still in his hand, finally understanding what powerless felt like. Jenna sank onto the edge of the couch, eyes unfocused, her plan dissolving in real time. Frank walked past them toward the door, Sophie at his side. The lockbox clicked softly as it swung in the breeze. And, for the first time in that house, Frank didn't look back. Marcus didn't wait long. The call came just after dusk, Frank's phone buzzing in his hand as he stood on the back porch, watching the sky bruise purple over the neighborhood. He answered without greeting. You think you won, Marcus said. His voice was tight, stripped of the forced calm he'd tried earlier. But if you don't fix this, I swear I'll tear that house apart before you hand it over. Walls, plumbing, everything. I'll make sure it's worth nothing. Frank listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he tapped the screen and set the phone down on the railing, the red recording icon glowing softly. Say that again, Frank said evenly. There was a beat of silence. Then Marcus exploded. He talked about betrayal, about humiliation, about how Frank had made him look weak. He circled back to the threat. Louder this time. Clearer. When he finally ran out of breath, Frank ended the call. He didn't sit down. He didn't pace. He went straight inside and dialed Miles Kendrick. Miles didn't sound surprised. Send me the recording, he said. Now. Minutes later, Miles called back. We're doing two things. First, I'm advising a civil standby if there's any contact at the house. Second, I'm sending a written warning to your son. Any damage, any interference, and this moves from civil to criminal exposure. Frank closed his eyes briefly. Do it. The email went out before the hour was up. Clear, documented, unemotional. Frank read the copy. Miles forwarded him and felt the familiar steadiness return. This was territory he understood now. Lines drawn in ink. Jenna tried next. She showed up unannounced the following morning. Eyes red, voice soft. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She cried. I'm sorry, she said, standing in the doorway like she didn't know whether she was allowed inside. Things got out of hand. We were scared. Marcus was under so much pressure. Frank let her speak. He didn't correct her timeline or her wording. He noticed how carefully she avoided the word control. We never meant to hurt you, she continued. We just wanted respect, balance. Frank waited until she ran out of rehearsed lines. Then he asked quietly, why did you say I don't help? Jenna froze, not visibly at first, just a flicker, eyes shifting, mouth opening, then closing again. She looked down at her hands, like the answer might be written there. Well, she said slowly, we needed... Frank didn't move. He didn't fill the silence. Jenna swallowed. You were in the way, she admitted finally, the words barely audible. There it was. Frank felt something settle, heavy but clarifying. This had never been about money, or chores, or contribution. It was about dominance, about who got to decide whose presence mattered, about shrinking him until he fit into a corner that made everyone else more comfortable. Jenna looked up, desperation creeping back in. We can fix this, I promise. Marcus didn't mean what he said. Frank shook his head gently. He meant it. So did you. She started to cry again, but it no longer moved him. Not because he was cruel, but because he was finally done confusing emotion with truth. "I won't fight you," Frank said. "And I won't rescue you from what you chose." Jenna stood there a moment longer, then nodded, defeated in a way that had nothing to do with the house. She left, without another word. Frank locked the door behind her and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. Outside, the house sat quiet, intact for now. But he knew Marcus. This wasn't over. The patrol car lights washed the front of the house in soft blue and red, more reflex than urgency. A neighbor had heard shouting again and called it in. Frank watched from the doorway as Detective Carla Wynn stepped out, notebook already in hand, eyes scanning the scene with practiced calm. "Mr. DeLeon?" she asked. Frank nodded. "That's me." She stepped inside without drama, taking in the half-packed boxes, the tension still hanging in the air like heat after a storm. "We've had a few calls connected to this address," she said. Not accusatory. Observant. "I'd like to understand what's going on." Frank didn't argue. He didn't minimize. He went to the table and brought back a folder, thick and organized. He handed it to her slowly. "That's the attempted fraudulent filing," he said. "This is the false missing person report. And these are recorded threats." Nguyen flipped through the pages, expression unreadable. Dates, signatures, screenshots. She paused on the audio transcript, then looked up at him. "You documented everything." "Yes," Frank replied. "I was advised to." She nodded once. "You were advised well." Marcus chose that moment to enter the room, shoulders squared, smile already in place. "Detective," he said warmly, "this is all a misunderstanding. Family stuff." Nguyen turned to him, eyes level. "Sir, I'll speak with you in a moment." Marcus didn't miss a beat. "My father's under a lot of stress. He's confused. We're just trying to help him." Nguyen's pen stopped moving. She looked at Marcus the way someone looks at a loose thread, curious, patient, already aware of where it leads. "You reported him missing," she said, "while he was in his own home, on the morning of a property closing." Marcus laughed lightly. "I was worried." "Concern doesn't usually include forged paperwork," Nguyen replied, flipping the folder around so he could see the discrepancies. "Wrong parcel number, mismatched signatures." Marcus's smile faltered, just slightly. Jenna stepped forward quickly. "We didn't forge anything," she said. "We don't know who did that." Nguyen turned to her. "Then you won't mind if I note that someone in this household attempted to cloud title on a property they don't own." Jenna went quiet. Sophie stood near the hallway, hands clasped tightly. Nguyen noticed her then. "You heard the argument earlier?" she asked gently. Sophie hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." "What did you hear?" Sophie took a breath. "My dad said Grandpa would ruin everything if he didn't stop the sale. He said he'd make sure the house didn't make it to the buyers." The room went still. Nguyen wrote it down carefully. Then she looked back at Marcus. "Here's how this works," she said. "Volume doesn't equal authority. Paper does. Proof does." Marcus's jaw tightened. "So what now? I'm the bad guy." Nguyen met his gaze without blinking. "Right now, you're someone who's very close to crossing from civil conflict into criminal exposure. Any further document tampering, false reports, or property damage, and you won't need to wonder what happens next." She closed her notebook and stood. "This is your warning." Marcus didn't respond. He just stood there, breathing hard, the weight of it finally sinking in. Nguyen turned to Frank. "If anything else happens, you call us. Immediately." Frank nodded. "I will." As she left, the house felt different, quieter, heavier, stripped of illusions. Marcus stared at the floor, anger drained of its power. Jenna avoided everyone's eyes. Frank looked at Sophie. She gave him a small nod. Scared but steady. Authority, he realized, had finally shifted. And Marcus knew it. Frank didn't pack in secret anymore. The morning after the detective left, he opened the closet doors wide and pulled boxes into the hallway where everyone could see them. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. Shirts folded, papers stacked, tools wrapped in rags. There was no drama in it, just a man preparing to leave a place that had already told him he didn't belong. Jenna and Marcus argued in the kitchen, voices sharp and tired. Not about the house, about each other, whose idea it was, who pushed too hard, who should have seen this coming. Frank heard it all without reacting, the words blurring into noise that no longer required his attention. Sophie stayed close, She followed him into the bedroom where Linda's things still rested in careful order, untouched since the funeral. The air felt heavier there, like the room remembered what it had been. Sophie picked up a scarf and pressed it to her face, tears coming fast and quiet. Frank sat beside her. He didn't rush her. Grief had its own pace. They sorted together. Letters, photos, small keepsakes with no monetary value but enough weight to anchor a life. Frank chose a sturdy box and lined it with tissue paper, placing items inside slowly. "This is yours," he told Sophie. "For when you're ready." She nodded, wiping her cheeks. "I don't want them to take this." "They won't," Frank said firmly. Rosa arrived just after noon, her truck rumbling into the driveway like a promise kept. She hopped out, took one look at Frank's face, and nodded. No questions, just action. She lifted boxes with ease, stacking them with practiced care. Marcus appeared in the doorway as they worked, anger giving way to desperation. "So that's it?" he said. "You're really leaving?" Frank taped a box shut. "Yes, you're leaving your own blood," Marcus said, voice cracking. "After everything." Frank straightened and met his son's eyes. "You pushed me out," he said quietly. "I'm just walking." Marcus had no answer. The words landed where shouting never had. By evening, the rooms looked different, emptier, honest. Frank stood in the living room one last time, not to reminisce, but to measure the space without himself in it. Sophie hugged him hard. Rosa rested a hand on his shoulder. Outside, the truck door closed with a solid click. Frank didn't look back as he climbed in. The house behind him felt smaller than it ever had. And for the first time, that didn't hurt. Miles Kendrick didn't call late unless it mattered. Frank was at Rosa's kitchen table when his phone lit up, the room smelling faintly of coffee and motor oil from the truck parked outside. He answered on the second ring. "I found it," Miles said. No greeting, no preamble. "Found what?" Frank asked, though something in his chest had already tightened. "The reason your son was in such a hurry," Miles replied. "And why that deed mattered so much." Frank leaned back in the chair, eyes closing. "Tell me." Miles explained it slowly, precisely. Marcus had taken out a personal loan months earlier. Not a mortgage, something looser, riskier. On the paperwork, he'd listed the Tampa house as his residence and implied future ownership. No forged deed attached, but enough suggestion to secure better terms. A promise without proof. He told the lender the property would be transferred soon, Miles said. That's why he pushed so hard. That's why the timing mattered. Frank felt the pieces locked together. The pressure, the sudden urgency, the fear masquerading as entitlement. Jenna knew, Miles continued. Emails, texts. She didn't sign anything, but she knew. She wanted the deed transfer to make the story true. Frank stared at the wall across from him, its paint chipped in places Rosa never bothered fixing. "So they weren't angry," he said quietly. "They were scared." "Yes," Miles replied. "Terrified you'd find out before they fixed it." After the call ended, Frank sat there a long time. The betrayal felt different now, not sharper, but deeper. It hadn't been about him at all. Not really. He'd been an obstacle, a risk factor, a signature that hadn't come fast enough. Marcus showed up that evening without warning. No shouting this time, no threats. Just a man who looked smaller than his body suggested. "I know you know," Marcus said, standing in the doorway. Frank didn't invite him in. He didn't need to. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair. Marcus sat. His hands shook when he clasped them together. "I messed up." Frank waited. "I took the loan because things were tight," Marcus continued. "I wanted to cover expenses, look like I had it handled, like a provider." He laughed weakly. "I didn't think it would spiral." "And the house?" Frank asked. Marcus swallowed. "I thought if I could just get on the deed, it would fix everything, make it real." Jenna hovered in the background, eyes red, saying nothing. Frank nodded slowly. "So you tried to provide," he said quietly, "with my life." The words landed hard. Marcus flinched. "I didn't mean." "But you did," Frank said, not raising his voice. "You risked my home, my safety, my standing, and you called it help." Marcus bowed his head. "I was ashamed." "I know," Frank replied. "That's why you did it." Silence filled the room. Not the charged kind, the empty kind, where excuses finally run out. "I'll fix it," Marcus said desperately. I just need time. Help. Frank studied his son's face, the familiar lines, the fear underneath the bravado. For a moment, the old instinct stirred. To rescue, to smooth things over, to pay the price so his child wouldn't have to. Then he thought of the agreement, the threats, the lies told with his name attached. No, Frank said. Marcus looked up sharply. No, you don't need rescue, Frank continued. You need consequences. Jenna inhaled sharply, as if struck. Frank stood. I won't pay your debt. I won't lie for you. And I won't protect you from the results of your choices. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to bargain with. Frank walked to the door and opened it. You'll figure it out, he said. Or you won't, but it won't be on my back. As Marcus left, shoulders hunched, Frank felt something final settle into place. The truth hadn't freed his son. It had freed him. The condo community sat just a few streets back from the marina, close enough that Frank could smell salt in the mornings if the wind shifted right. Beige buildings, trim lawns, nothing flashy. The kind of place people chose on purpose, not to impress anyone, but to breathe. Frank unlocked the door with a new set of keys and stepped inside alone. The space was modest, one bedroom, clean lines, sunlight cutting across tile floors. He set his box down in the middle of the living room and stood there for a moment, listening. No voices through walls, no footsteps overhead, just quiet. That night, he slept deeper than he had in years. The next few days were practical. Frank changed his mailing address, then his passwords. He confirmed his credit freeze and tightened it further, like cinching a belt one notch tighter than before. He updated beneficiaries on accounts he hadn't touched since Linda died, pausing briefly when her name appeared, then continuing without apology. This wasn't erasing her, it was continuing. Miles handled the rest. He drafted an education fund for Sophie protected, specific, unreachable by anyone but her. Frank signed without hesitation. She'll never know stress like this if I can help it, Frank said. That's the point, Miles replied. The noise tried to follow him. Jenna called relatives, left messages framed as concern, asked people to check on Frank. When that didn't work, she tried guilt by proxy, family, friends, old neighbors. Frank blocked each number calmly, methodically, like closing windows before a storm. Marcus didn't call at all. The lender did. Frank didn't hear the conversation, but he saw the effect. Marcus showed up once at Rose's place, jaw tight, eyes hollow, asking questions without answers. The house was no longer a shield. No one was stepping in front of him anymore. For the first time, the pressure sat where it belonged. Sophie visited after school on Thursdays. She brought her backpack, kicked off her shoes, and claimed the small couch like it was hers. Frank taught her how to make grilled cheese without burning it. They ate at the counter, knees nearly touching. This place is calm, she said once. Frank smiled. That's the idea. They talked about school, about money, about how bills worked and why credit mattered. He didn't lecture, he explained. Sophie listened like someone collecting tools she intended to use. When she left, the condo stayed quiet but not lonely. One evening, Frank sat on the balcony with a mug of coffee, watching boats slide in and out of the marina. He realized he wasn't bracing for the next conflict. His phone stayed silent. His chest felt lighter. He finally understood what peace felt like when it wasn't borrowed from endurance. Frank leaned back, keys resting heavy in his palm, and thought not for the first time that this was what help was supposed to feel like. And for once, it was his to keep. Marcus learned quickly how small the world gets when leverage disappears. Listings vanished before he could call back. Deposits doubled. Landlords asked questions he couldn't answer. Cleanly credit checks, employment stability, references. Each rejection landed like a quiet verdict. He'd built his confidence on ownership he never had, and now every door reminded him of it. At night, he sat at the kitchen table scrolling listings while Jenna paced. The conversations turned sharp, then cruel. "This is your fault," she said one evening, not bothering to lower her voice. "If you hadn't pushed him, if you hadn't gone along with it," Marcus shot back. They stopped pretending they were on the same side. The cracks widened fast. Jenna slept on the couch. Marcus slept badly. Pride, once armor, now felt like dead weight. 2 weeks passed before Marcus showed up at Frank's condo. He didn't call ahead. He didn't knock softly. He stood at the gate, jaw set, like he still belonged somewhere he didn't. When Frank stepped outside, He closed the door behind him, Marcus noticed. His eyes flicked to the handle. "So that's it? I don't even get to come in?" "This conversation doesn't require it," Frank said calmly. Marcus scoffed. "You really think you can just cut me off?" "I think I already have," Frank replied. They stood there, the marina breeze cutting the heat. Boats clinked softly against their slips, indifferent to the tension. Marcus shifted, anger leaking through frustration. "I need help," he said finally. "Real help." Frank studied him not as a father searching for excuses, but as a man measuring boundaries. "What kind?" Marcus hesitated. "Money." Frank didn't flinch. "No." The word landed flat and final. Marcus's face twisted. "You can't be serious." "I am," Frank said. "But I'll help you another way." He reached into his pocket and handed Marcus a folded card. "Financial counseling, credit recovery, legal aid for negotiating debt." Marcus stared at it like it was an insult. "You think I need a pamphlet?" "I think you need accountability," Frank replied. "And I won't fund another lie." Marcus laughed bitterly. "You really don't care anymore." Frank shook his head. "I care enough to stop rescuing you." Silence stretched between them. Marcus looked past Frank, at the quiet condo, the clean lines, the life he couldn't enter. He swallowed hard. "So that's your boundary," he said. "Paper and rules." "Respect," Frank corrected. "Truth. And no more paperwork games." Marcus clenched his fists, then let them fall. He had nothing left to threaten with. No house, no leverage, no audience. "Fine," he muttered. "Keep your money." He turned and walked away, shoulders tight, steps fast, angry, ashamed, and empty-handed. Frank watched him go until the gate closed behind him. He didn't chase. He didn't call out. He went back inside, locking the door with a soft, deliberate click. For the first time, Marcus had left without taking anything with him, and Frank felt the weight of that shift settle quiet, permanent, and necessary. Frank chose a small bank near the marina, the kind with tellers who still remembered names and didn't rush people through life decisions. Sophie sat beside him, feet swinging slightly off the chair, hands folded in her lap like she was trying very hard to be grown. "This isn't about how much you have," Frank said as they waited. "It's about knowing where it goes." They opened the savings account together. Sophie signed her name carefully, tongue pressed against her teeth in concentration. Frank showed her how deposits worked, how interest grew quietly if you let it, how money behaved better when you paid attention instead of pretending it didn't matter. On the walk back, she was quiet longer than usual. "I was scared," she finally said. "Of what?" Frank asked. She kicked a pebble along the sidewalk. "That I'd turn out like them, always fighting, always lying about money." Frank stopped and turned to her. He didn't sugarcoat it. "You don't become someone by accident," he said. "You become them by repeating their choices." She nodded slowly, absorbing it. "Character," Frank continued, "is what you do when nobody's clapping." The words stayed with her. He could see it in her face. That evening, Rosa came by with takeout, and a bottle of cheap wine she insisted tasted better if you didn't overthink it. They ate at the small condo table, knees nearly touching, laughing at stories that didn't hurt anymore. Rosa teased him about becoming a minimalist. Frank teased her about still driving like she was late for everything. At one point, Rosa raised her glass. "You look lighter," she said. "I feel lighter," Frank replied. Dana stopped by the next day with the final closing packet. No drama, no loose ends. Everything clean, recorded, finished. Frank signed the FANUS, last page, and handed the pen back without ceremony. "That's it," Dana said. "You're officially done." Frank nodded. "Good." Over the next week, he donated most of the furniture he didn't need. The heavy dining table, the extra chairs, the things that had once held a family together but now just took up space. He kept only what mattered: tools, photos, a few books, Linda's watch. The rest went quietly to people who needed them more. One night, sitting alone on the balcony, Frank realized something that surprised him. Selling the house hadn't been the revenge. Refusing to be used had been. The power hadn't come from taking something away. It came from stepping out of reach. He finished his coffee as the marina lights flickered on below, boats rocking gently in the dark. Tomorrow would come without conflict, without demands. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like winning. The call came late. the way apologies often do when pride finally gets tired. Frank was halfway through a book when his phone buzzed on the side table. Marcus's name lit the screen, dimmer somehow in the quiet of the condo. Frank stared at it for a full breath before answering. "Dad?" Marcus said. His voice was lower than Frank remembered. Smaller. "Can we meet? Just us?" "No, Jenna." Frank hesitated, then nodded to himself. "Where?" "Denny's on Bayshore," Marcus replied. "If that's okay." It was past midnight when they slid into opposite sides of the booth. The diner smelled like coffee that had been sitting too long and something fried clinging to the air. The waitress took their order without comment. Sensing the weight between them, Marcus stared at the tabletop. "I need to say something," he began. "And I need you to hear it." Frank folded his hands and waited. "That night," Marcus continued, "when I said you eat, but you don't help, I meant it to hurt." He swallowed. "I wanted to shame you. I thought if I embarrassed you enough, you'd sign. I didn't think—" His voice broke. "I didn't think about what it would do to you." Frank said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and honest. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, finally forced to sit with his own words without being interrupted or defended. "I miss Mom," Marcus said quietly, "every day. And when she died, I felt like I failed at everything. Work, money, being a provider." He rubbed his face. "I couldn't stand feeling like I was falling behind, like I wasn't enough." Frank listened. He let the confession land fully before responding. "Grief doesn't excuse cruelty," Frank said calmly. "It explains it, but it doesn't erase it." Marcus nodded, eyes wet. "I know." Frank leaned back slightly. "If there's a way back from this, it's not quick." "I'll do anything," Marcus said quickly. "No," Frank replied. "You'll do specific things." Marcus, still. "Time," Frank said. "Consistent respect. And therapy. Not once. Not to check a box. Real work." Marcus nodded again, slower this time. "Okay." Frank held his gaze. "I'm not forgiving you tonight." "I understand," Marcus said. The waitress returned with coffee, setting the mugs down quietly. Steam rose between them. Frank took a sip. "This is the truth," he said. "You don't rebuild trust with words. You rebuild it by not needing leverage." Marcus looked down, then back up. "I hear you." Frank studied his son's face, older than before, lines deeper, bravado gone. He saw someone finally listening instead of defending. That didn't mean everything was fixed. It meant something had finally started. They stood outside the diner a few minutes later, the night air cool against their skin. Marcus hesitated, like he wanted to say more, then stopped himself. Frank nodded once. That was enough. As Frank drove home, the city lights blurred past. He felt no rush of relief, no triumph, just the quiet understanding that truth had finally been spoken, and that the next steps would matter far more than the words said tonight. Summer rain tapped softly against the condo balcony, steady and patient, like it wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere else. Frank stood by the sliding door with a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching droplets gather and fall again. The marina beyond blurred into muted blues and grays. Boats rocked gently, unconcerned with anyone's reckoning. He liked mornings like this, quiet enough to hear himself think. A knock came mid-morning light, familiar. Sophie stepped in with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a rolled poster tucked under her arm. Her hair was damp from the rain, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the tile. "I've got a project," she said. "About family legacy." Frank smiled and gestured to the table. "Sounds serious." She unrolled the poster carefully, revealing handwritten notes and photos taped in neat rows. Names, dates, questions scribbled in the margins. "They want us to talk about what gets passed down," she explained. "Not just money." Frank considered that for a moment. Then he stood and crossed to the small filing cabinet by the wall. He opened it and pulled out a familiar folder, thick, worn, edges softened by time. He set it on the table between them. "This," he said, tapping it lightly, "used to feel like a weapon." Sophie frowned slightly as he opened it. Inside were copies of the old deed, tax records, receipts, evidence of ownership and responsibility. Frank didn't linger on the pages. He let Sophie see them, then closed the folder again. "It's not about the house," he continued. "It never really was. It's about knowing where you stand, And not letting anyone convince you that your worth depends on what they can take from you. Sophie nodded slowly. So, boundaries? Frank smiled. Exactly. She looked up at him. Dad says helping means everyone pitching in. Sometimes, Frank said. But real help isn't being used. It's being valued. The words landed quietly. Sophie wrote them down without asking. A little later, as Sophie packed up her things, Frank's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen. Marcus. He didn't rush to open it. When he did, there was no apology this time. No argument, just proof a screenshot of a counseling appointment confirmation. Another message followed. A second job. Evening shifts. Frank exhaled slowly. Not relief. Not pride. Just a loosening he hadn't realized he was holding. Sophie noticed his expression. Everything okay? Yes, Frank said. It will be. After she left, the condo returned to its soft quiet. Rain still whispered against the balcony. Frank sat back down with his coffee, now lukewarm, and let the moment stretch. He didn't call Marcus. He didn't text back right away. Some things didn't need immediate applause. He looked around the room, simple furniture, clear space, nothing he hadn't chosen. For the first time in years, there was no sense of being watched, measured, weighed for usefulness. Frank smiled to himself and murmured, almost amused by how true it felt now. Now that's help.